So one thing I was always told is be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. And with the SEC Media Days being this week, we've heard a lot of chatter. But one thing I want to focus on today is something we've heard from the Auburn players both this week and the weeks leading up to this week about the game with the Alabama Crimson Tide this year, and we have got to break it down. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. And with the extra layer of chippiness with the Iron Bowl this year so early, are you excited for the Iron Bowl to finally be upon us? And let me know what you're thinking there. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification. I do constant college football content and you don't want to miss any of it. And if you did enjoy that content, be sure to like and comment down below. But with all of that being said, we need to jump into this in a week filled with topics for us to talk about. Now, yesterday I talked about the news with the University of Texas and Oklahoma wanting to join the SEC, and this is going to be something I revisit possibly this weekend. I just want a little bit more information to come out. That way we can get a little bit more of an intriguing and in-depth conversation about what it is this will mean and all of that. But for this video in particular, I want to talk about what it is the Auburn players have been saying, and this goes back to pre-SEC Media Days. When defensive transfer Tony Fair posted on Twitter that they were going to take the head off of the elephant this year. And look, I understand that when you're in a rivalry situation, you, one, have to have confidence in your own team. This is a physical sport, and you can't walk into a Saturday believing you are going to lose. That's already the losing mindset. But at the same time, for the Auburn Tigers this far out to be calling out the Alabama Crimson Tide seemed like a bold play, especially when you look at the history of those teams that have called out Alabama. Nick Saban does not take kindly to call-outs, and it's something we talked about earlier this offseason when Jimbo Fisher jokingly called out Nick Saban. And we all said, you know, Saban took it in jest, but he absolutely put that card in his back pocket, and he's waiting for that Texas A&M game to reap that revenge. As petty as it may be, Saban is a hyper-competitive guy, and he builds his teams to be hyper-competitive. They're certainly not alone, but when you hear this sort of chatter and you look at the history of how this chatter has gone pre-Alabama games, the Alabama Crimson Tide really doesn't need any more fuel on top of a fire, so throwing this type of chatter on there usually doesn't work out too well. But we also heard from Bo Nix today that he says they are not scared of the Alabama Crimson Tide. And first and foremost, this is a mindset that, like I said just a bit ago in this video, I think you have to have. I don't mind at all Bo Nix saying that they have no fear of the Alabama Crimson Tide. I would hope that they didn't, because if he went up there and said, we're scared of the Crimson Tide, that's not what Auburn fans want to hear, and that's not a good place to start before the season has even begun. And certainly Bo Nix has ability, and that's why Bryan Harsin is very intriguing this year, because Bo Nix has had an up and down career to this point, and they're looking for some consistency and seeing if Bryan Harsin can be the catalyst to that consistency. Outside of Bo Nix, you have Tank Bigsby, a hyper talented running back, really one of the most talented running backs in the nation that you absolutely have to worry about. But when you look at the dichotomy of the Alabama versus Auburn game this year, the thing that stands out to me is Alabama returns 8 people on defense. And even more than that, I mean, they lose Christian Barmore, but we know how Alabama does with their defensive front. They have constant rotation. They lose Dylan Moses, but the only silver lining there is that 2 years ago, I mean, when the season begins, it'll be 2 seasons ago, the Crimson Tide had to play a full season without their 2 starting linebackers that were the starting linebackers going into that season because they both got hurt. And because those 2 other linebackers got to play, the Tide are in a position where not only, if we just exclude Henry To'o from the conversation, the depth they have opposite of Christian Harris is already really compelling. Shane Lee, Henry To'o there now, obviously, and then Jalen Moody being a guy that we're all very intrigued about. Then the last guy you have to replace is Patrick Surtain. The Crimson Tide, once again, are looking to a veteran guy. The conventional wisdom would dictate right now in Jalen Armour Davis, someone who I talked about the other day, has been someone who the Tide staff have looked to before, but has just had an injury-laden career up to this point. Something that if he can get that taken care of, if there's no injuries, super talented young man, very excited to see what he does. But even further than the guys who we know about, the guys who are looking to make a name for themselves could be huge for the Crimson Tide this year. Whether we're talking on offense, defense, the Crimson Tide are going to have a lot of people that are looking to make a name for themselves, both young and guys that have been in the program for a few years that are just getting their opportunity. Now, we realize that the offense has replaced a lot, but even when you look at what it is the offense has to replace, you still look at a situation where the offensive line is going to be very talented. You have one of the highest rated quarterback prospects of recent memory, and all he did was throw for 300 plus yards in a day without a complete offensive line, without all of his wide receiver weapons, and without all the running back weapons. Speaking of the running backs, the Crimson Tide, in my belief, have the deepest running back room in the nation. Absolutely the best running back room in all of college football is found at the Alabama Crimson Tide. That's not a knock at any other running back rooms. I mean, I can name you running backs that I think are equally just unbelievably talented. Bijan Robinson, Tank Bigsby, Breece Hall. I can go on and on with talented running backs. But top to bottom, there's not a room deeper than the Crimson Tide. But the Crimson Tide have 3 guys who are former 5-stars that are fighting for that number 2 role right now in the running back room if Brian Robinson is to take that number 1 role. So even though the Crimson Tide replace a lot, it's still not wise to call out Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide, because when you look at it as what they're bringing back, it's going to be an incredibly talented team. It's going to be a team that is looking to prove something, because a lot of people are going to be talking about how much they have to replace. They're going to be looking to answer that call, and then you turn your attention to the defense, which is absolutely ferocious. They lose guys, but then they get in a guy such as Henry To'oTo'o. Nick Saban identified that was one of the best players in the SEC, he felt like, and that's why they were so adamant about getting him into the Crimson Tide. This is going to be an awesome year this year. Not even just the Iron Bowl. And I'm not saying that this is surprising or even a novelty right now that we're getting chippiness at this stage, right with the season around the corner. But when you have this, it is going to be something that we're going to have to think back on when the Iron Bowl comes, because the way Nick Saban likes to motivate his troops, any ammunition you give him, he's going to pin it on that wall. And you can bet that the Crimson Tide are going to have plenty of ammunition with things such as, we're going to take the head off the elephant. They're going to be ready for Auburn this year, and I, for one, cannot wait. Hop down to the comments. Let me know what you thought about Auburn's comments and Auburn's players' comments, because even though Auburn and Alabama, they have a rivalry, and Auburn has some talented guys, doesn't seem wise to poke the bear in a year where you're trying to replace an entire coaching staff as far as the head coach goes. So really interested to see what y'all have to say. That's it. See ya.